50 years ago, a serious watch collector could walk into a room and name 20 complications most people today have never heard of. And one of those complications, the last one on this list, is so strange, so specific, and so completely forgotten that when I tell you what it does, you're going to wonder how it ever existed in the first place. Here's what this video is. We're counting down 20 watch complications that collectors in the 1960s and 70s knew cold. Complications built for fishermen, for divers, for sailors, for mountaineers, and in one case for a pocket watch commissioned by a queen that got stolen in a real museum heist and disappeared for 25 years. These aren't obscure for the sake of being obscure. They were forgotten because the industry moved on, because quartz happened, because the market narrowed, and the people who knew them best either aged out or stopped talking. I've spent serious time in the archives on this one, so let's get into it. Number 20. Solar food dehydration gets all the nostalgia, but watch collectors have their own version of that story, and it starts here. The jumping numeral display. Elgin, the American watchmaker, built mechanical wristwatches in the mid-20th century that showed the time as numerals flipping into little windows instead of using hands at all. No sweeping motion, no dial to read, just numbers changing mechanically, like a tiny slot machine telling you it's 3:47. This was decades before digital watches existed. The movement used a cam and spring system that stored energy and then released it all at once, snapping the disk to the next number in an instant. Collectors called it direct read, and the reason it matters is simple. Elgin proved that the mechanical world had already imagined digital before electronics got there. The quartz revolution didn't invent the idea of reading time as numbers, it just made it cheaper. Number 19. Rendering tallow tells you something about how people solved problems before there was an easy answer. The Cornavin decompression table dial is the same kind of thinking. In the 1950s and 60s, some dive watches didn't just have a rotating bezel, they had an actual Navy-style decompression table printed directly onto the dial. Stop time depths and ascent rates right there on the face of the watch. And because the hour hand was essentially useless 40 feet underwater, some versions shrank it down to a tiny window just so the decompression scale could take up more real estate. Think about that engineering decision for a second. The watchmaker looked at the hour hand and said, "The diver doesn't need that right now." So they moved it out of the way. That's not a complication in the traditional sense, it's a philosophy. The watch exists to keep you alive, not to tell you what time dinner is. Number 18. The Favre Leuba Bivouac. Most people have never heard of Favre Leuba, which is a shame, because this Swiss brand built one of the most practically ambitious wristwatches of the 20th century. The Bivouac didn't just tell time, it had a working mechanical altimeter built into the case, designed for mountaineers who needed to read their elevation, not their schedule. It used air pressure to calculate altitude, the same principle as a barometer, and it did it mechanically, with no battery, no electronics, nothing but gears and a calibrated aneroid capsule. Collectors who knew the Bivouac sought it out for the altimeter, not the hours. That's the part that's hard to get your head around today. The time was secondary, the mountain was the point. Number 17. The Angelus Tinkler. Angelus is a brand that barely registers outside serious collecting circles today, but in the mid-20th century they built something almost nobody else was building, a wristwatch quarter repeater. Repeating complications chime the time on demand, press a pusher, and the watch rings out the hours and quarter hours in sound. By the time Angelus built the Tinkler, repeaters had essentially vanished from wristwatches. The technology existed in pocket watches going back centuries, but shrinking it down to a wristwatch case and making it work reliably was considered nearly impossible. Angelus did it anyway. They called it the Tinkler because of the delicate sound it made, and it disappeared so completely that most collectors under 50 have never seen one in person, let alone heard one chime. Number 16. Gerald Genta is one of the most famous names in modern watch design, the man behind the Royal Oak, the Nautilus, watches that defined what luxury sports watches look like. But here's the part of the Genta story that almost never gets told. His own brand, Gerald Genta, put its signature retrograde hand, a hand that sweeps forward and then snaps back to the start instead of going in a full circle, on watches featuring Disney characters, Mickey Mouse, Fantasia, Pinocchio, full cartoon licensing, on watches built with the same retrograde mechanism used in serious haute horlogerie. The collision is jarring if you think about it. The same technical soul that lived in a $50,000 complications watch was also ticking away behind a cartoon mouse. Collectors who find them today aren't sure whether to laugh or bid aggressively. Most of them do both. Number 15, Hublot's golf scoring complication. One Big Bang Unico variant tracks golf strokes hole by hole and totals the round. Not a chronograph, not a timer, just a stroke counter built specifically for one sport. You tap a pusher for each shot and the watch keeps your score. That's it. That's the whole complication. And the reason it belongs on this list is what it tells you about how watchmakers thought about their customers. They weren't building abstract complications anymore. They were building tools for specific people doing specific things on specific afternoons. The golf watch is almost too literal to be elegant, but there's something honest about it that the industry mostly abandoned when it decided that complicated had to mean celestial mechanics and perpetual calendars. Number 14, the Marie-Antoinette pocket watch. In 1783, someone, historians believe it was an admirer of the French queen, commissioned Abraham Louis Breguet, the greatest watchmaker who ever lived, to build a watch with every complication then known to exist. No expense limit, no deadline. Breguet worked on it for years. He died in 1823 without finishing it. His son completed it 4 years later in 1827, more than 4 decades after the original commission. It ended up in a museum in Jerusalem, and in 1983 it was stolen, a real jewel heist, the watch simply gone. It didn't surface for 25 years. When it finally reappeared, it was because the thief's widow revealed where it had been hidden. The watch had been sitting, waiting for a quarter century. Breguet spent a lifetime building it. A thief hid it in a room for longer than most marriages last. Number 13. Now, I want to come back to something I mentioned at the start, the complication at the end of this list that almost nobody saw coming. We're getting close to it. Keep watching. Number 12. The Gallet multichron yachting. Big Eye. Racing a boat is fundamentally different from racing a car. On dry land, the car and the track aren't in constant motion. Regattas work like this. A starting indicator initiates a countdown and the competing vessels must maneuver so they cross the starting line as close to the actual race start as possible. Cross early and you're heavily penalized. To help skippers time this precisely, Gallet modified their chronograph to create a regatta timer. The totalizer on the Big Eye is calibrated with individual minutes marked next to a red wedge, and once they run out, the countdown is over and it's time to cross. By the 1960s, Gallet had developed an excellent version of this complication dedicated to helmsmen and skippers. Dubbed by collectors the multichron yachting Big Eye, it joined a list of Gallet innovations that included the first wrist-worn chronograph, the first waterproof chronograph, and the first regatta timer. The Big Eye exists nowhere outside competitive sailing. There is no other context in which you'd need it, and that specificity is exactly why collectors love it. Number 11. The Heuer Seafarer and the solunar tide complication. Toward the end of the 1940s, Abercrombie & Fitch requested a special watch from Heuer based on the solunar theory, popularized in the 1930s by angler John Alden Knight, which posited that a sportsman could determine optimal times for hunting and fishing according to the position of the sun and moon. For fishermen, this meant reading the tides. Charles Edward Heuer tasked his young 15-year-old son Jack with developing the watch, who in turn took the problem to his high school physics teacher, and together they developed the basis for the solunar. The idea was built on the then in vogue belief that solunar cycles could determine the best times for hunting and fishing. Wildly unscientific as a premise, baked into a very serious mechanical watch. Abercrombie & Fitch and Heuer eventually combined the tide indicator with a 3-register chronograph, and the Seafarer was born. It was produced from the 1950s to the 1970s, making surviving examples rarely found. The idea that a Swiss watchmaker solved a lunar tide equation with a high school physics teacher and then sold the result at a sporting goods store is one of the best origin stories in horology. Number 10. The Elgin direct read gets a second mention here because the category it represents, mechanical pre-digital displays, is broader than most people realize. Jump hour watches, sector displays, wandering hour complications, all of them were attempts to make mechanical time reading feel more like reading a number and less like interpreting a dial. They were solving a problem that the quartz industry eventually solved differently, but the mechanical solutions were often more beautiful and always more interesting. Number 9. Cornavin's decompression dial deserves a second look too, because it raises a question the industry quietly stopped asking: what if the watch's job was survival, not status? The dive watches that came after, the Submariner, the Seamaster, the 50 Fathoms, cleaned things up. They made the bezel elegant and the dial readable, but they also made a choice: simplicity over information density. The Cornavin made the opposite choice. It put everything on the dial and trusted the diver to read it. That's a different philosophy about what a tool watch is for. Number 8. The Favre Leuba Bivouac and the altimeter complication point to something bigger. During the mid-20th century, watch companies churned out interesting complications in order to solve problems that arose as a new leisure class came into being. Mountaineers needed elevation, sailors needed tide times, divers needed decompression schedules, and watchmakers responded to each of those needs with a mechanical solution. That era ended, GPS ended it, but the watches it produced are still out there, and they still work. Number 7, the Vacheron Constantin reference, 57260. If you want to understand how far the concept of complication can be stretched, this is the answer. The most complicated watch ever made at the time of its creation, the reference 5726U is a double-dial horological masterwork of almost unimaginable technical innovation, conceived over 8 years by 3 master watchmakers, featuring no less than 57 complications, several of which were entirely novel. The watch took 8 years to assemble and has 2,926 parts and 31 hands. It displays the Gregorian, Judaic, and lunar calendars across its 57 complications. The Hebraic perpetual calendar alone can be considered one of the greatest contributions to mechanical watchmaking in recent times, due to the long-term changing cycles of the Hebraic calendar and its difference from the Gregorian. Making a complete functioning mechanical Hebraic perpetual calendar had been considered impossible until this watch. The word complicated barely covers it. This watch doesn't tell you the time, it tells you the time, the date in 3 different calendar systems, the position of the stars over your home city, the length of the day, the equation of time, and when Yom Kippur falls. It does all of that mechanically, with no battery, running on a wound spring. Number 6. The Angelus Tinkler again, because the repeating complication deserves more than one mention. What made it remarkable wasn't just the engineering, it was the timing. Repeaters had been considered a pocket watch complication for so long that the idea of hearing your wristwatch chime the quarter hour felt almost anachronistic when Angelus released it. They were reviving something that the industry had declared dead, and they were right that it wasn't dead. The repeater is back today in a big way, on the wrists of collectors who will spend 6 figures to hear a watch chime. Angelus just got there first, quietly, in a case small enough to disappear into a jacket pocket. Number 5. The Gerald Genta Disney retrograde. I want to come back to this one because the retrograde complication itself is worth understanding. A retrograde hand doesn't go around the dial in a full circle. It sweeps forward through an arc, say 60 minutes, and then at the end it snaps back to 0 instantly, like a rubber band releasing. The snap is the point. It's kinetic and dramatic and entirely mechanical. Genta used it for date displays for minutes, for seconds, and then he put it on a watch with Mickey Mouse on the dial. The result is a collector's paradox, a watch that is simultaneously too serious to be a toy and too playful to be a dress watch, which means it belongs to a category of exactly one and the people who collect it know that. Number 4, the Hublot golf complication again, because the philosophy behind it is the thing. When you strip away all the mechanical poetry, the tourbillons, the minute repeaters, the perpetual calendars, what you're left with is a simple question. What does this person actually need to know? The golf watch answered that question for one specific person on one specific afternoon. That's either the most honest thing a watchmaker can do or the most absurd, probably both. Number 3, the Marie-Antoinette. A watch commissioned in 1783, finished 44 years later, 4 years after its own maker's death, stolen from a museum in Jerusalem in 1983, and hidden for 25 years until a widow finally told someone where it was. Every single stage of that story is stranger than the one before it, and the watch itself, every complication Breguet knew how to build stacked into one case, is sitting in a museum in Jerusalem right now if you want to go see it. It came back. The thief's widow gave it back. That's the ending. Number 2, the Bivouac altimeter, one more time, because it represents a category of watch that is completely gone. Nobody builds a mechanical altimeter wristwatch today. The GPS watch made it redundant, but the Bivouac was doing something that no GPS watch does. It was solving an elevation problem with nothing but air pressure and a spring, using the same physics that governs weather forecasting, miniaturized into a case you could strap to your wrist. There's a purity to that solution that the digital version doesn't have. The Bivouac didn't need satellites, it needed atmosphere. And now, number 1, the one I told you about at the beginning. The complication that's so specific, so strange, and so completely outside the normal vocabulary of watchmaking that most collectors, even serious ones, have never held one. The Heuer Seafarer's solunar tide complication. I know we touched on it already, but here's the part that earns it the top spot. The solunar was built on the idea that solunar cycles, the position of the sun and moon, could determine the best times for hunting and fishing. That theory, the solunar theory, is not scientifically proven. Fish may or may not bite better at certain moon positions. The evidence is anecdotal at best. And yet a serious Swiss watchmaker, one of the most respected chronograph houses in history, hired a high school physics teacher to help solve the mechanical problem of displaying it on a wrist-worn instrument. The task fell to Jack Heuer and his physics teacher, Dr. Heinz Schilt, who together designed an accurate tide display mechanism that would power the solunar. A disc inside the watch rotates once per lunar month, geared to show tidal cycles as the moon causes the tides, with a small pusher for synchronizing the tide indication to local tide times. The result was a watch that combined the precision of Swiss mechanical engineering with a folk theory about when fish are hungry, and it worked, not because the solunar theory is correct, but because the tide display itself is accurate. The moon does move the tides. That part is real. The fishing part is optimism. And the fact that Heuer built both of those things into a single chronograph, sold it through Abercrombie & Fitch, and produced it for 2 decades, that's the part nobody talks about anymore. These 20 complications didn't vanish because they failed. They vanished because the market moved on, because quartz arrived, because GPS made altimeters redundant and smartphones made tide tables free. The craftsmen who built them retired. The brands that made them were absorbed or closed, and the knowledge of what those watches could do faded out of the general conversation, kept alive only by the collectors who kept buying them at estate sales and auction houses, who knew what they were looking at when everyone else walked past. You now know what they knew. If this is the kind of deep dive history you want more of, hit subscribe. We go this far into the archives every single week. And drop a comment below. Which of these complications would you actually want on your wrist? The golf counter, the solunar tide, the decompression table? I read every one of them. And if you want to keep going, the video on the right is exactly where to go next.